Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today I'll be discussing Yemen. Are the Houthis overreaching? Joining us on the show is Sharif Nashashebi, an award-winning journalist and analyst on Arab affairs. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
When we look at Yemen and when we look at the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia were the first to start with the revolution, and then Yemen joined. How was the revolution in Yemen? Because nothing actually happened when we look back in time.
Well, I mean, the revolution resulted in the ouster of Saleh, who was the president for decades at the time. But the transition period has been extremely rocky and has basically gone from bad to worse. At the moment, you have a very real possibility of the country splitting up, either into two states or even more. You have a resurgent Al-Qaeda, you have the Houthis who have made sweeping military gains in the last several months. The president who has escaped house arrest and is setting up his own administration in Aden, away from Sana'a. And you have Sunni tribes now who are rising up against the Houthis. So there are so many players at the moment. I mean, it's a situation as complicated as in Libya at the moment. They have so many players, with different agendas. It's a difficult country to follow, let alone to run.
But before we actually look at the Houthis, why did the Yemeni nation want to remove the president at the time?
Well, this was the general theme of the Arab Spring, where people were fed up with dictators, with economic mismanagement, with corruption, with human rights abuses, with the lack of freedoms and democracy. This Yemen was typical of that. Saleh had ruled with an iron fist for decades, and people were fed up. And as with other Arab Spring states, his crackdown was heavy-handed. Peaceful protesters were killed. So then, they started to become violent. And eventually there was an agreement brokered by the Gulf Cooperation Council for him to step down, although to get immunity from prosecution. So he stepped down, but now there are accusations which are increasingly well-founded that he is in collusion with the Houthis and trying to gain back his influence. UN investigators actually recently pointed to collusion between the two sides. That's something both sides have denied. But more and more evidence suggests that is the case.
How come he still wants to get back into power?
Because dictators always want to get back into power.
No, but then when we look at it, because at the time when people are protesting, he kept promising the nation that he's going to be bringing more equality and he's going to be serving the nation in the way that they want. And he stepped down from that dictatorship in a way. Of course, the violence and the army attacking the people was still taking place, but he kept promising that he's going to be doing the change.
His position became untenable basically because the situation domestically was reaching a point which he couldn't contain anymore. And also, crucially as well, the Gulf states had basically had enough of it, particularly Saudi Arabia. So they realized that they couldn't keep him on anymore. And once they turned their backs on him, and given also the domestic situation, he had to step down. The fact that he was offered diplomatic immunity was a major thing as well, because they were all afraid of prosecution or even execution afterwards. So he was still allowed to be in the background, and seeing how the transition has taken place, how there are so many divisions and problems in Yemen. I think he felt that this was an opportune time for him to make a comeback while there was so much division and chaos, and to come perhaps as a savior of Yemen again.
But then when you're saying that the Gulf, were tired of him and gave their back to him, isn't that a bit hypocritical in the sense that they themselves, are running a dictatorship? So how come they didn't allow him to continue?
Well, yeah, Yemen has always been considered the backyard of Saudi Arabia, and there are close ties between the two states. So, given that Saleh was in power for decades, he was a reliable partner, not just to the Gulf countries, to the US as well. He was a reliable partner, and this kind of goes down to the crux of the problem that contributed to the Arab Spring, was that people were tired of this feeling that powers outside the region and even within the region could rely on dictators to to keep stability and peace with an iron fist, and that trumped everything else. People got fed up with that, and Saleh was one of those dictators who were deemed reliable and useful by other countries. But eventually, once people rise up domestically to the point that the dictators themselves feel threatened, but also outside powers say, well, he's no longer reliable anymore. So that's what happened to him. And again, now he thinks that he may be able to come back and tell people, well, look what happened without me, and why don't you have me back again? So.
But when he stepped down, and what actually took place after that? Because all we hear from news is corruption, to be honest.
Well, there was a transitional period where Hadi, the current president, basically ran unopposed in the elections. There were concerns about that it wasn't a properly fought out election. But then he seemed to be a consensus candidate. So, although there were concerns, people said, well, okay, for now, let's continue with this transition. He had the backing of the Gulf states, of the US, and but this started slowly derailing, but then very fast. Once the Houthis kind of expanded beyond their traditional northern strongholds and swept through the country and took over the capital late last year. That then has really unraveled, because you've had attempts at negotiations and a political process that have really never taken off the ground. I mean, they've been boycotted. Political parties that have attended have walked out, citing threats and irreconcilable differences and things like that. And then also you have the situation, an armed situation on the ground that doesn't necessarily reflect the goings-on in the negotiating rooms. So it's the more complicated it gets, the more difficult it is for a negotiated solution, because there's no dominant power broker. There's so many different players. Sometimes they have alliances of convenience, sometimes they change those. So it's a very fluid situation.
But who are the Houthis?
Well, they are a Shia sect in the north, traditionally in the north. They're a minority community. They have long complained of marginalization, with justification, I think. And initially, they made their demands as part of Yemeni demands. They claimed to speak on behalf of Yemenis, to represent their grievances. And to an extent, I think that's why when they took over the capital, initially there was very little resistance, because they were seen as their grievances were seen as part of the wider grievances. But pretty much, straight away since then, they've been ruling by diktat. They have been increasingly, putting down protests, detaining journalists, torturing, abducting people. And the more heavy-handed the tactics have been, there have been very widespread now protests against them. People have taken up arms. So there has been a very fast backlash. As fast as they have come in, there is now a backlash against them. And I think they have overreached, because they are a minority community. If they think that they can govern a large country with a large population and a very divided and fractious one like Yemen, the way that they're doing, I think this is a big mistake. They are not trying to settle differences by consensus. They are threatening. They are harassing.
But how come they would do that though? Like, as they've been marginalized and they've seen and felt the torture, wouldn't they be the ones? Wouldn't you expect them to kind of bring justice?
I think power may have got to their heads. I think they may have been emboldened by the speed with which they made their progress, and felt that because of their newfound strength, that they could impose themselves. That's the only reason I can think of for their tactics. But it's not working. It simply isn't working. And now I think they are going to find it extremely difficult, not just to expand, but even just to consolidate the gains that they have made in the last few months.
You said that the UN believes that the ex-president and the Houthis are working together.
Yeah.
Do you actually agree with that? Because I don't understand how...
I think so. I mean, there have been... besides the accusations, there have been, media reports on the ground of credible media reports of collusion between the two, of sources from anonymous sources from both sides acknowledging that those links exist. So there, the evidence had been growing for some time, and the UN investigation really cemented that idea that there has been collusion between the two sides. So I think that is going on. I think ultimately that hurts the Houthis because, for example, the same UN investigation said that Saleh had siphoned off tens of billions of dollars under his rule. I mean, Yemen is such a poor country. I believe the figure was something like $60 billion. So for the Houthis to claim that they are speaking on behalf of the people and yet then ally themselves with the dictator who was widely reviled and ousted.
That's the thing that's really confusing.
Well, yeah, I mean, they may have thought, well, this is a way of bolstering our power, but I think they were maybe counting on the fact that that kind of collusion wouldn't have made the light of day as it did. But that certainly doesn't help their cause. They cannot collude with a hated dictator and then claim to speak on behalf of the people. That's
the thing. Like they can't. Them doing that is just showing them as a group or as a party or whatever they claim to be as a tribe, to be like hypocritical in the sense that they wanted him to be removed, yet now they're actually working with him. And is his power that strong that they believe working together is gonna bring them more power?
Well, I think that's obviously what they believed in terms of that collusion. I think they must realize now that the situation has come to a point that they are facing difficulties they didn't think they would face, and now I think they're at a crossroads where they have to decide whether they're going to crack down harder at the increased unrest against them, or whether they're going to realize, okay, we do need to be more consensual and conciliatory. I think if they carry on the way they're doing, that's going to be their undoing, because they can't control the situation.
But then when we look at other countries and when tribes do become empowered, it's not really easy for them to step down. They actually, become worse than the previous president or the previous dictator.
Well, this is the big post-Arab Spring malaise, is that we haven't learned from this fundamental issue in the Arab world and also in other regions, that people will not forever accept dictatorship over themselves. And then when a dictator's toppled, the person who takes over talks the talk and then acts just like the predecessor.
Not worse.
Thinking that somehow it'll be different this time, and it's not. And this is the big problem in the Arab world. But this has been helped by the fact that there is now the resurgence of this mindset that stability should come above all else. So if a dictator happens to replace the previous dictator, maybe we should tolerate it because there's so much chaos. So now we're going back to this old mindset that led to the Arab Spring. So I think this might work for a while because people are genuinely afraid of all the chaos going on. But this again is going to lead to another major regional upheaval at some point in the future.
But then did President Hadi lack with the whole equality and justice? Like, what did he do wrong that people felt that they have to do a revolution again?
Well, this wasn't a popular revolution against Hadi. This was Houthis coming in, taking over the capital. This wasn't a popular revolution. So this is the crux of the problem. I mean, Hadi, I don't think has been in power long enough to see through the transition period, and there are very many problems. But the point is, he was largely a consensus candidate. His government was recognized by the UN. So now you have ostensibly two rival governments. Since Hadi escaped house arrest, he's set up base in Aden. There is the Houthi-run administration in Sana'a. Like in Libya, one is recognized by the international community, one is a pariah, and you have now two rival administrations, and both sides are hardening their positions. Hadi has made much stronger statements since he escaped house arrest. And the region as well, is the Gulf states are lining up with him. So you're now seeing a solidification of two. It's not just two rival camps. I mean, within there are also other factors, but you're seeing two administrations now in Yemen.
But then the Houthis are a minority. How are they able to take over the capital?
Well, because the situation on the ground is so fractious that it wasn't as if they were facing a unified common, force in Yemen. You have Al Qaeda, who are not just fighting the Houthis; they are also fighting the government. You have various tribes. You have generally a very militarized situation in Yemen. So I think the fact that there were all this division, and that the Houthis, never underestimate. If you are well armed enough and have the necessary training, you can make gains beyond what people might think would be capable. But the issue with that, though, is being able to consolidate those gains. So, for example, in other countries like, Al-Shabaab in Somalia or Ansar ad-Din in Mali, whatever, these small groups can make very sweeping gains, but then they can't hold them because they alienate the local population, and that's their undoing, because military gains on their own, you cannot keep that forever. So they may mistreat the locals, and that's the beginning of the end of, then you see them all having to be pushed back. So I think the Houthis are risking going down exactly that same path.
But then, as Hadi is being recognised, by the UN and other committees, how come they're not actually? Do you think that they can support him so they can actually remove the Houthis or keep them calm?
Well, the UN is, they're trying to broker a process to bring the two sides together. That's all they're really able to do. The Gulf states, initially they had cut off military and economic aid to the government, for various reasons. I think they didn't want that kind of aid to fall into the hands of the Houthis. They don't want the Houthis to be able to run the country properly. They want to dissuade other factions in Yemen from cooperating with them. So those were punitive measures. But now there are reports, unconfirmed reports, of Gulf states sending money and arms to various tribes who are fighting the Houthis. So I think at the moment you have a very fluid situation where the Gulf states are extremely concerned. Initially it was, apart from cutting aid, it was condemnatory statements saying that they won't stand idly by. But I think the fact that the Houthis have been getting support from Iran has galvanized those Gulf states to say, well, okay, we can't just take a hands-off approach. We have to be more proactive. So I think this is now why they are aiding certain Sunni tribes who are fighting the Houthis. So this has now taken on a regional dimension. It's once again this arena of, Yemen might be the local battlefield, but it's a wider battle between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran, and with all the sectarian and geopolitical elements that entails. So yeah, it's not just a conflict of Yemen, it's now become regional.
Why is that always the situation? The fact that when we look at Syria, when we look at Iraq and Yemen, and even in Bahrain, with Bahrain it's a bit different, but kind of the same, that when there is this whole, different groups and different tribes of the Sunnis and the Shia, you would have Saudi Arabia funding the Sunnis and Iran funding the Shia. Why doesn't Iran and Saudi just do the war that they need to do and leave the other countries alone?
Because it's always less costly for countries to have proxy wars. Look, the Cold War. There was never a war between the US and the Soviet Union. It was always easier for them to give arms to other people to kill each other. It's always a way. It's much more effective that way. Proxy wars are always the favorite of powers who talk tough but don't actually want to make the necessary sacrifices. So again, now in the Middle East, as you had a proxy war between the Soviets and Americans, you are now getting this kind of regional rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran that will never result in a direct war between the two countries. But you're just adding to the arenas where they are playing out their indirect battle.
But then why they I don't understand why would they keep funding them? It's firstly, it's costly for both countries, and secondly, it's just making the situation worse.
Because generally proxy wars are generally wars of attrition. They hope that if one side sticks it out long enough, the other side will tire and lose. So with the Cold War, eventually the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's basically that both sides in any proxy war become very stubborn and say, if I hold out longer than the other person, they will lose heart and give up. And then with each different crisis in the region, different countries see those crises as an opportunity to not just to extend their own influence, but to try and thin their opponent's influence even more. So I think Yemen is just one of those various arenas in the region.
But then with Al-Qaeda being in Yemen, and as they're fighting both the Houthis and the actual current government, what do they aim for and what do they actually want?
Who, Al-Qaeda?
Yes, Al-Qaeda. Well,
Al-Qaeda, it's very difficult because they've been active in Yemen for quite some time, but their goals are not particularly clear. I mean, certainly political goals, military goals, they just seem to be against the powers that be, whether it's the Houthis or the government. So they've become, although they've become now a very galvanized force in Yemen, it's very difficult to deal with them because they don't have a set manifesto or agenda that people can relate to or look at. So, but it's very problematic because they have anyway been probably the most dangerous wing of Al Qaeda in the region after the demise of Al Qaeda in Iraq. And now the spread of the Houthis has enabled Al Qaeda to portray their presence in Yemen as necessary against Shia expansionism, against Iranian influence. And they made a call to arms, a Sunni call to arms, and many Yemenis have taken that call to arms, and that also raises the prospect of foreigners coming in to take that call to arms. So, like in other areas of the region, they have portrayed themselves, as ISIS do, as bulwarks against Shia and Iranian expansionism, and I think Houthis have played into that by colluding with Iran and by talking one thing but acting as if they are being now the new overlords of Yemen.
Well, then when we look at that situation, how come, I don't understand this whole sectarian thing, because this is the only thing that allows people to actually, take their weapons and go to war. And even in foreign countries, they actually would fly to the country and start fighting. But then is it, in Yemen, was it really that bad when we look at the sectarian situation?
Well, it was there. I don't think it was as bad as it is now, because I think now you have the added element of, and this is not unique to Yemen, but of the parties in Yemen appealing to Sunni or Shia forces outside and saying, look, we're your community, we are now in danger, come help us. So they are encouraging help from the outside based on sect, and outside powers who want influence or who want to ward off their opponent's influence are encouraging that too by saying, yes, we are here as defenders of this sect. So from within and from without, it's in the interests of various parties to play up sectarianism to give them a foothold in the area.
But none of the sects are actually going by their actual religion, which is not to create war. So isn't it hypocritical?
Religion. How many wars throughout time have been based on either religion or one's interpretation of religion? I mean, this is an age-old issue that people talk of peace and coexistence, but then they interpret texts as justifications for the most horrendous acts that humans can commit. So it's nothing new in interpretation of religion.
But then the Houthis, when looking at them, do they actually believe that they can govern Yemen?
I think they do. I think now, although they'll never say it, I think now they may be thinking, okay, what do we do now? This has kind of gone beyond our expectations. I think their actions, although when they took over Sana'a, straight away they were saying, we want to set up a transitional process and set up a new a government, an inclusive one. I mean, they were saying all the right things, but very quickly acting on the contrary. So that to me gave the impression that they did think that they could either rule on their own or rule with outside help or with an alliance with Saleh. But yeah, I think the statements were kind of mainly statements to allay other people's fears, but on the ground they were alienating people very quickly, and protests now have grown in frequency and size. This year now they've had the biggest protests yet in Yemen against the Houthis, and they have abducted journalists covering them. They've tortured protesters. That's classic pre-Arab Spring. Well, at the start of Arab Spring, that's the behavior that led to these upheavals, and they've not learned.
But then why don't they just do an election where if they are wanted, then they would actually be elected?
Well, to have an election, you have to have an agreement between various parties who hold sway in the country to be able to run an election smoothly. And at the moment, that just hasn't happened. Negotiations have been boycotted. Parties have left. I mean, there are parties that have taken part in negotiations who have left and said, we're leaving because we're being threatened by the Houthis, who are saying, either accept this or you're going to face repercussions. And one of the representatives in the National Dialogue from the Islah Party was abducted by the Houthis. He's the guy who's supposed to be there negotiating, and he was abducted. So the entire process has broken down, the negotiating process. And without an agreement between the parties, you simply cannot hold elections.
Can the UN help in this situation?
They're trying, but all they can do is try and get the parties together. But beyond that, they can't. If the parties themselves are unwilling to agree, the UN can't force them to. So they are hamstrung by that. They can only go so far if the parties on the ground are not willing to go further.
But then, this kind of is making it out to be as if there's no light at the end of the tunnel, because if they're not willing to, come together and speak about the situation and come to an agreement, then how is Yemen actually going to settle? At
the moment, I understand people who don't see a light at the end of the tunnel at the moment, because things have gotten very bad very quickly. And things were never very good in Yemen, but now they are much worse. But I think a major reason for distrust is that there have been agreements in the last several months. There have been agreements made, but that have been very quickly abandoned or broken. So now there's just a lack of trust as well, is that, well, even if we agree an agreement, well, who's to say that it's going to stick? I mean, the Houthis themselves have agreed to various agreements and then very quickly just abandoned them. For instance, in terms of forming a government, in terms of agreeing to withdraw from Sana'a, those things didn't happen. So that's now made it much harder for an agreement, because there's no more trust.
But then what forced the Houthis to actually, stop the people from protesting and abducting people and killing and torturing others?
Because I guess these protests were growing in size. They didn't want them to get out of hand. But it's the classical, dictatorial behavior of, well, instead of actually listening to the people, let's kill enough of them that they keep quiet. It doesn't work in the long term, certainly. Because
they could have just said that because they wanted to be that voice and be that group that's going to be bringing justice and bringing peace, even though when saying that, we know in no country around that actually does exist, but to a certain extent, couldn't they just tell them just wait until we get this done?
Look, look at all the dictators that were toppled in the Arab Spring: Mubarak, Ben Ali, Gaddafi. When they gained power, they all said all the right things. I mean, when they came to power, they looked like the wonderful reformers. So saying the right thing is very easy, and then actually acting that way is a completely different thing. And so talk means nothing anymore in the Arab world, because you see, it's easy to say the right things, but then there's a history of that just being a ploy to claw your power back and establish a power base. So I don't think the Houthis are acting different in that respect. Is that they say this, but then they do that.
So what's Hadi's situation now? What is he planning to do?
He's based in Yemen, in Aden, sorry. Again, he's calling on he's saying Sana'a is an occupied capital. He is meeting, within a few days of him moving to Aden, he met with the governors of about half Yemen's provinces, including the largest ones. And he met with the head of the Gulf Cooperation Council, he met with the Gulf ambassadors. The Gulf ambassadors have left Sana'a to be based in Aden, to be closer to him. So very quickly he is trying to establish himself as the leading figure challenging the Houthis. So I think now this is why I said earlier that you're seeing the formation now, I think, of two rival administrations. And I think Hadi has moved quite quickly since his house arrest to set himself up as the main challenger of Houthi power.
Do you think he'll be able to actually, topple the Houthis?
At the moment, I don't think either side will be able to achieve a convincing victory. There's going to have to be a consensus. The problem is, I think at the moment it's so polarized that both sides think that if they are stubborn and tough enough, that they will wear down the other side. But at the moment, I don't think that's possible. I think Houthis need to worry perhaps more, because firstly they are a minority community. They have to recognize that they can't govern this whole country, certainly the way they're doing, in the long term. And also in terms of foreign help, if Hadi is getting help from the Gulf, for example, I think that kind of help will be able to go much further than, for instance, Iranian help to the Houthis. Iran's economy is struggling. It's already militarily committed in Syria and Iraq, and it's one country. You have 6 wealthy Gulf states who are on the other side, who can take low oil prices economically for longer than the Iranian economy can. So I think the Houthis need to worry that in a war of attrition, they are probably not best equipped to win that war of attrition.
But do you think they actually realize this?
It's difficult to say, because at the moment, in these kind of crises, everyone talks stuff. They may have reservations, behind closed doors, but they'll never air those reservations, because the point is to look tough and to shore up people's morale and shore up your support base by saying, we're on the road to victory, just, bear with us.
But if worse came to us, do you think that Yemen is going to be another version of Libya?
It is at the moment already. I mean, you have, again, 2 rival camps. You have, you have sectarianism, you have jihadism, you have foreign powers involved. These are failed states. Libya and Yemen are failed states. And Yemen already was a failing state for quite some time, and it's now very well into the failed state territory.
But then if Yemen was to actually be, split up, and you would have the Sunnis on one side and then the Shia on the other, do you think that would actually be better for the country?
But it wouldn't be split along those lines, because
like to a certain extent with splitting, they would give as much land to the Shia as much as they need, and then the rest to the Sunni.
Even if the country was split, probably there would not be one side of Yemen that would be predominantly Shia. I mean, it's a small community relatively to the rest of the population, so and even a split wouldn't be necessarily along Houthi and Sunni lines, because there has long been a secessionist movement in the south. That's been around long before this latest flare-up, and they have now been pressing, given the increased chaos in the country, they have been pressing for independence in the south, feeling that this is a more opportune time because of all the uncertainty. So the Yemen could be split along various lines, and not necessarily sectarianism may play a part in it, but I don't think it can be split cleanly along those lines, and certainly there are other movements involved that have been there long before the rise of the Sunni-Shia divide.
But then when thinking about it, if the Sunnis and if there was to be a split according to the tribes and to the people's interest, wouldn't that be more of a sectarian war, in the sense that Al-Qaeda would be going to the Houthi state and vice versa, for them to do their own jihadist, activities?
Certainly it would be, certainly for the region and for the power brokers in Yemen, it would be a nightmare, because obviously it's much harder to control numerous unstable statelets than it is a proper state. So yeah, it would be, a major problem. Already Yemen has been a hotbed of militancy and problems that have spilled over regionally. So I think that would certainly make it a lot worse, and it's by no means certain that if Yemen broke up along certain lines, that whatever comes up as a result would be stable or have any kind of longevity or viability. So it's very uncertain.
When going back to Hadi, how come he was arrested?
Well, because this was part of Houthis trying to stamp their control, wanting to control, basically, set up their own government to have control over it. And I guess they thought Hadi wasn't playing ball or wouldn't play ball to the extent that they wanted. So they arrested not just him, the whole government was put under house arrest. I think now the defense minister has also just escaped house arrest. So that has greatly emboldened Hadi, because since he escaped house arrest, he doesn't feel any need to try and be conciliatory towards the Houthis. Now he's outside of Sana'a. So I think, it was just a method of enforcing their control in Sana'a, hopefully having for them a rubber stamp government that would kind of be there, really be there for their interests, but being claimed as a kind of government of the people. And I think that was a major blunder for the Houthis, because since then the protests against them have really flared up since then, because that was a very major sign that actually they were not interested in consensus, placing the whole government under house arrest, and then threatening government ministers who wouldn't cooperate with treason. I mean, this whole thing was just showing people that you are no better than the people that you claim to want to get rid of because of corruption and brutality and all this.
So can we say that Houthis are very similar to ISIS? But of course, them being from different sects?
I mean, they have they would be like natural enemies. I mean, I don't think you can say that they're similar. They are similar to the extent of any power in the region, and this can encompass all manner of groups and individuals who want to seek power and maintain power at all cost. This is the fundamental problem of the entire region. It's not limited to one sect or one ideology or.
But what made them come to this conclusion that they can actually run the government itself and they can, put all of these ministers and governors under home arrest?
Well, as I said, because they made such sweeping gains. No one expected that. I mean, the Houthis have been disenfranchised in Yemen for a long time, and there was an insurgency for some time, but it was always based around their stronghold in the north. No one expected that they would break out as quickly as they did and make the gains that they did. Maybe they were even surprised by it. So I think maybe they were emboldened. They said, okay, we've gone this far, maybe we can do this. But the more they've tried to consolidate their gains, they have ended up alienating more and more people, and that's been their problem. But I think they may have just said, we're doing really well, and it may have got to their heads.
Is the US, interfering with Yemen, or has it just taken a back seat?
Well, they are still carrying out drone strikes in Yemen, which I think is just complicating the situation. Because firstly, so the drone strikes target Al-Qaeda. That potentially strengthens the Houthis. That also potentially strengthens Al-Qaeda, because that emboldens people to join their ranks, because it's seen as fighting Western imperialism. These drone strikes kill civilians, so that makes Yemenis more angry, which then further emboldens forces like Al-Qaeda, who are seen as fighting the US. This is a headache for Saudi Arabia, which is next door. The US has been, in terms of intelligence sharing, they've said that intelligence sharing would continue in Yemen, implying that they may be willing to cooperate with the Houthis. So I feel that in Yemen, this is again a very typical policy of Barack Obama of wavering, of not really being sure what to do. So going through. Let's do various avenues at the same time and see what happens. They seem to be feeling their way in the dark. But I think each of the policies they're pursuing in Yemen is not helpful at all. It's possibly making things worse, and I don't think they're thinking through actually the repercussions of their actions in Yemen.
But then, as you said, the drone strikes is actually going to be helping the Houthis even more, which is kind of weird because the Houthis are being funded by Iran. So how come the US is helping them?
The US, the US under Barack Obama, the foreign policy has had no consistency. I mean, one can say that George Bush was more consistent, although committed terrible blunders. He was consistent in blundering, whereas Obama blunders in very different through inconsistency. So, for example, in Syria, he decides when they launched the aerial campaign against ISIS, they also target al-Nusra. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, al-Nusra and ISIS were fighting each other in Syria until this campaign decided to target both of them, and now they're fighting to an extent alongside each other. So it boggles the mind to think, well, what do you think you're achieving? You have a potential war between jihadist groups, and now you are giving them common cause by targeting both of them. The US does things in the Middle East that really boggle the mind in terms of any kind of strategy, and I think Yemen is just another example of this, where the situation on the ground changes, but they stick to a certain policy because because that's what they've been doing, and they don't realize that now this may change things considerably. Barack Obama, I don't think really knows what he's doing in the region. He's just kind of feeling his way in the dark, and he's not really winning anyone over. I mean, you have certain governments in the region saying, oh, we need American leadership and everything, but people on the ground are saying, well, they're just causing trouble, whether they mean to or not. It's just constantly making situations worse in these countries.
But as Saudi Arabia, our alliance with the US, can't they kind of influence them in the sense that not to do more drone strikes?
Well, Saudi Arabia is in a precarious situation as well, because it has waged a years-long war against Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia itself, and it has been supporting the Yemeni state against Al-Qaeda. But it has also fought against the Houthis and doesn't want the Houthis to take over. So Saudi Arabia, in terms of its own interests, is stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one side, if they weaken the Houthis, they embolden Al-Qaeda, or vice versa. So I think, again, the Gulf states, and Saudi included, have because there are no particularly effective and viable options at the moment, they've taken a largely hands-off approach. There have been talks recently between US and Saudi officials. There haven't been much details about it, so it's probably all closed-door stuff. But I'm sure they are trying to find the common approach in Yemen. But as I said, the situation on the ground is such that you have two opposing forces who are opposed also by the US and Saudi. Both sides oppose them. So it's this kind of very undesirable pendulum. Well, what do we do? Because if we do one thing, the other side will gain strength. And it's a very difficult situation, particularly for a new king. You have a new king in Saudi Arabia. Yemen is going to be probably his biggest immediate foreign policy challenges. And it's a very difficult one. And he doesn't also want to do anything in Yemen that might cause any instability in Saudi Arabia itself. So it's a very difficult situation.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Sharif, for joining us again on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.